Patricia Hearst, heiress to a $25 million fortune, was violently ripped from the safety of her home, abducted at gunpoint by a militant group while her boyfriend lay beaten and helpless. From that moment on, the nation was enthralled, gripped by a fear that echoed the horror of the Manson murders, reminding everyone that no one, not even the privileged, was safe. What began as a tale of terror soon morphed into something far more shocking. The public watched in disbelief as tapes emerged, not of a frightened victim pleading for help, but of Patricia, now calling herself Tanya, boldly aligning herself with her captors. Outrage swelled as she appeared on camera, wielding a weapon during a bank heist, no longer a debutante, but a revolutionary. The media circus was relentless, feeding the public's insatiable hunger for every twist and turn in the story. Headlines blared, covering every detail as the lines between victim and villain blurred. And when she was finally captured, raising her fist in defiant solidarity with her captors, the world was left speechless. But the question remains, was it brainwashing from weeks of abuse, where she did what she had to survive? Or had she really transformed and rebelled against her life of privilege? If you like content like this, please subscribe to the channel or consider supporting us on Patreon. We post new videos every week. And now let's get into the abduction of Patty Hearst. Patricia Campbell Hearst was born into a life gilded by wealth and legacy, the third of 5 daughters in Hillsborough, California, a haven for the affluent. Yet even the grandeur of her family's mansion paled beside her grandfather's sprawling estate, San Simeon, the Versailles of the West, set high atop La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill. There, amidst gilded halls and opulent gardens, the myth of the Hearst dynasty was etched into California's landscape, an empire of stories and spectacle. But within these walls of privilege, Patricia, or Patty as she was known, grew not unlike the rose bushes that bordered those halls, groomed for beauty, yet confined by expectation. A string of Catholic schools sought to shape her into the perfect debutante, a figure of grace to uphold the family name. Yet the well-laid plans of the Hearsts took an unexpected turn when their striking daughter fell, not for another heir to wealth, but for her math tutor, Stephen Weed, a man whose name alone whispered of rebellion against the manicured life she was destined for. When Weed left for a graduate position in philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley, Patty followed. The two moved in together, an act that defied the traditions she had been raised with. At Berkeley, she enrolled as an art history major, but her interest in the larger world seemed as remote as the San Simeon towers. The echoes of protest and revolution were growing louder outside her windows, the Vietnam War staggering to its painful close, the Watergate scandal disassembling the old guard in Washington, and the Black Panthers rising with fists held high. But Patty remained detached, a quiet observer in a world aflame. She was a flower rooted in luxury, untouched by the tumult around her, but even the most sheltered rose can be swept up in the winds of change. What began as indifference would soon unravel into something far darker. Fate, like a slow-moving storm, was already gathering on the horizon, and Patricia Hearst, child of wealth and promise, would soon be pulled into a vortex of violence and transformation so profound that the girl she once was would become all but unrecognizable. Her metamorphosis was inevitable, not a leap into a new life, but a slow, tragic unraveling, a quiet flower caught in the jaws of a hurricane. In February 1974, the fragile veneer of Patty Hearst's gilded life was shattered with a single knock at the door. The promise of safety dissolved in an instant when Stephen Weed, her fiancé, opened the door to a young woman who claimed her car had broken down. But behind this seemingly innocent facade lurked chaos. Moments later, 2 armed men stormed inside, their intentions as brutal as they were swift. Weed was left bloodied and broken, the violence raining down in the form of a shattered wine bottle. Patty, barely more than a teenager, stood helpless as her world splintered. Bound and blindfolded, she was dragged from the sanctuary of her life of ease, clad only in a blue housecoat, into the cold, unyielding trunk of a car. The nation would soon awaken to the chilling news, a story too sensational to ignore. The kidnapping of an heiress, one with the legendary Hearst name, ignited the imagination of a public eager for a spectacle. The press, like scavengers circling fresh prey, descended on the story with the same fervor they had for the Lindbergh baby's abduction decades earlier. The conflation of wealth, violence, and mystery was irresistible, and so began the transformation of a teenage girl's captivity into a media circus. The captors were no ordinary criminals. The Symbionese Liberation Army, a ragtag group of self-styled revolutionaries who branded themselves as modern-day Robin Hoods, had orchestrated the abduction. They spoke of symbiosis, a harmony between people and their causes, but their philosophy was an unholy mix of black power rhetoric, Maoist revolution, and nihilistic rage. For the SLA, this was not merely a kidnapping. It was a performance, an act of defiance against the very system they despised. And with the daughter of one of the country's wealthiest men in their clutches, they had found the perfect stage. As the days turned into weeks, the nation sat glued to their televisions, witnessing the SLA's grand theater of insurgency. Patty's disappearance became the lead story, and the radical rhetoric of the SLA, once the angry mutterings of an underground group, was now broadcast into millions of American homes. They ranted about capitalist pigs, about the rot of imperialism, and the decay of a nation built on exploitation. Yet, beneath the bravado, there was something almost absurd about their demands and their lifestyle. These revolutionaries, who promised to tear down the corrupt system, shared a communal toothbrush and espoused free love. Their anthem? A chilling slogan that resonated like a death knell. Death to the fascist insect that preys on the life of the people. At the heart of this storm was Randolph Hearst, Patty's father, a titan of the newspaper world. His empire had once been built on the very sensationalism that now ensnared his family in a web of terror. As he waited, desperate for word from his daughter's captors, the irony of his life's work must have been bitter indeed. Now it was his daughter's life, her fate, that filled the front pages. But if the kidnapping was strange, what came next was beyond comprehension. A tape arrived, not with pleas for help or confessions of fear, but with a declaration from Patty herself. Her voice, steady and unwavering, called the SLA her comrades and denounced her family as capitalist pigs. The voice was familiar, but the message was alien. The transformation had begun, and America watched, bewildered, as the once detached heiress embraced her captor's ideology. April brought another tape, and with it, another shift. Patty, now calling herself Tanya, after Che Guevara's fallen lover, Tamara Bunke, declared that she had been given a choice: return to her life of privilege or fight alongside the SLA for the freedom of the oppressed. She chose to stay and fight. With that decision, she severed the last thread tying her to her old life, relinquishing not only her name, but her identity. The image that followed, a photograph of Patty, or Tanya, standing before the SLA's seven-headed cobra insignia, was a final, haunting testament to her metamorphosis. Once the darling of high society, she now stood as a soldier of revolution, cloaked in the symbols of radicalism, her transformation complete in the eyes of the world. But behind the slogans and the defiant poses, the question remained: was this true revolution, or was this simply survival cloaked in rebellion? The line between victim and villain was blurring, and the world was left to wonder. Had Patricia Hearst been transformed by her captors, or had Tanya always been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when she could break free? The Symbionese Liberation Army did not deal in currency. Instead, they trafficked in chaos and defiance. Rather than demand a ransom in cash, they sought an exchange of bodies, Patty for two of their own, locked away on murder charges. It was an audacious gambit, one met with cold refusal by Governor Ronald Reagan. The SLA, undeterred, had another scheme in mind: a multi-million-dollar food program for the poor, paid for by the Hearst family. It was a gesture as grand as it was doomed, an illusion of charity that unraveled into disorder. Trucks rolled through the streets like chariots of false salvation, tossing cans of food like bones to hungry dogs. What was meant to be a show of goodwill devolved into chaos, with riots breaking out as people fought for the scraps. The SLA's utopian vision, if it ever existed, had crumbled into farce, but the real performance was yet to come. April arrived, and with it, an image that would sear itself into the American consciousness. Tanya, no longer Patty, stood at the heart of an SLA robbery at the Hibernia Bank, a symbol of rebellion with an M1 carbine in hand, her face shadowed beneath a black beret. It was a sight both jarring and magnetic, the once sheltered heiress now transformed into a soldier of revolution. The grainy frames of the surveillance footage flickered across television screens like a nightmare unfolding, her figure ghostly but unmistakable, shouting orders to terrified bank tellers. The world gawked, and the press, once sympathetic, turned feral. The narrative had shifted. No longer was she the kidnapped debutante, but a dangerous radical, and the public was eager to see her fall. In the span of a month, Tanya was again on the move, this time spraying bullets in a Los Angeles sporting goods store during yet another robbery. It was clear now, there was no turning back. The line between victim and willing participant had blurred beyond recognition. She had not simply fallen under the spell of her captors, she had become one of them, or so it seemed. The transformation was complete, and the nation, hungry for justice, watched as the LAPD closed in. In May, the police surrounded an SLA safe house, and the siege that followed was as violent and surreal as the events leading up to it. Smoke billowed into the sky, gunfire echoed in the streets, and when the dust settled, 6 of Tanya's comrades lay dead. The LAPD, with grim satisfaction, joked that SLA now stood for so long assholes. But for 16 more months, the remaining members, including Tanya, evaded capture, living off the land, scavenging, stealing, surviving like cornered animals. The end came in San Francisco, not with a grand shootout, but with the quiet precision of a police tip-off. The nation held its breath as Tanya, Patty, was led away in handcuffs. She did not weep, did not plead. Instead, she raised her fist in a defiant salute, a final gesture of solidarity with her captors, or perhaps with the revolutionary self she had crafted. The press clamored for answers, but the real question lingered, heavy and unspoken. Was she the Patty Hearst of Hillsborough or the Tanya of the SLA? The trial that followed was a spectacle unto itself, as electrifying and divisive as the Manson trial that had transfixed the country 7 years earlier. The Hearst family, wealthy and powerful, enlisted the talents of F. Lee Bailey, a lawyer whose name would one day be immortalized as part of O.J. Simpson's dream team. Bailey spun a tale of captivity, painting Patty as the ultimate victim of Stockholm syndrome, a young woman brutalized and brainwashed into submission. He told the jury of her 57 days locked in a closet, subjected to physical and mental manipulation, the full extent of which YouTube will not allow me to say. Bailey said the abuse was so thorough, she had no more free will than a marionette in the hands of her puppet master. But the prosecution had its own story to tell. To them, Patty was no victim, but a rebel without a cause, a privileged girl who had found her purpose in the arms of radicals. They painted her as a willing participant in her own metamorphosis, someone who had longed to shed the skin of her former life and had found her new self in the shadow of violence and rebellion. And so the jury and the country waited. Would they see in Patty the innocent abducted or the radical born anew? Was she a victim of circumstance or a product of her own desires? The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the press feeding the public's insatiable hunger for drama. The jury's decision would come swiftly, but its implications would haunt the country for years to come. Patty Hearst had been kidnapped, but by whom? The SLA, or something far more insidious? The forces of identity and circumstance, the invisible shackles of her own making? The verdict would declare her fate, but the question of her transformation would linger, unanswered, like a shadow on the wall of her cell. Her trial was less a legal proceeding than a public reckoning, with the nation eager to see her punished, her image more reviled than even the Zodiac Killer, still at large in California. When the jury returned after just one day with a verdict of guilty, it was clear that Patty would pay the price, not only for the crimes of the SLA, but for the nation's simmering rage against youth rebellion and privilege. She was sentenced to 7 years, a swift and brutal judgment, though her true trial had begun long before she ever entered a courtroom. Her defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey, would later reflect on the many ways she was a victim, not just of the SLA, but of the American people. To the masses, she was a symbol of everything they feared: the radical youth, the privileged elite, the wayward child. The left saw her as the spoiled rich girl who had danced with revolution for sport, the right as an ingrate who had spat in the face of her inheritance. And the Hearst family, watching in horror as their daughter was led to prison, saw the whole ordeal as nothing less than a second kidnapping. Yet, as the press plastered her face across magazine covers and splashed her name in bold letters, it was clear. Patty Hearst was no longer a person, but a story, one that the world would not soon forget. At the medium-security prison in Pleasanton, California, the heiress to a $25 million fortune worked for 2 cents an hour, serving meals to other inmates as she wryly noted, "The tips are lousy." The world had turned her into an icon of criminal rebellion. But inside the prison walls, she was simply another name on a roster, sharing space with the infamous Lynette Squeaky Fromm of the Manson family. Yet even here, notoriety lingered like a shadow. When Squeaky attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford, she briefly stole the spotlight from Hearst, but only briefly. For the press, Patty Hearst was still a saga in motion. It wasn't until President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence after just 22 months that the tale seemed to reach its close. Later, Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon, perhaps swayed by the influence her family still wielded. As Patty walked free, more than 100 reporters and photographers swarmed the scene, eager to capture the image of a woman who had lived so many lives. And as she re-entered the world beyond prison, forever haunted by the ghosts of her past, she found an unlikely savior in Bernard Shaw, a man who would become her rock in the years to follow. Shaw was no revolutionary, no radical. He was a divorced police officer who had once been hired as her bodyguard. But in him, Patty found the stability that had eluded her for so long. They married quietly in 1978, far from the headlines that had dominated her life for years. The wedding, held on a military base for fear of kooks, was more than just a union. It was Patty's first step toward reclaiming some semblance of normalcy. Her parents, doubtful of the marriage's success, gave a Sears vacuum cleaner as a wedding gift, a far cry from the grandeur expected for the wedding of a Hearst. But the marriage lasted, and in the years that followed, they had 2 daughters, Jillian and Lydia, a testament to the quiet life Patty tried to rebuild. For decades, the black-bereated Tanya faded into the background, replaced by the society matron Patricia Hearst Shaw. She played the role of a mother, a wife, and eventually a widow after Shaw's death, though the specter of her past never fully left her side. At a Thierry Mugler fashion show in Paris, she briefly stepped back into the spotlight, strutting down the runway in sky-high shoes and performing a striptease, her only true brush with the outrageous in a life otherwise determined to remain quiet. Another flicker of her past life emerged when she acted alongside Johnny Depp in Cry Baby. But aside from these rare moments, the once notorious heiress receded into the comfort of small-town obscurity. Wilton, Connecticut became her refuge, an enclave of wealth and quietude, where neighbors included Keith Richards and Paul Newman. Here, Patricia cultivated a new identity, one far removed from the glare of media scrutiny. Her carefully coiffed hair and tailored clothes gave no hint of the woman who had once wielded a gun in the name of revolution. The only vestige of her past was a state-of-the-art security system in her home, a quiet nod to the inescapable shadow of the SLA. And yet, even as she bred French bulldogs for the Westminster Kennel Club, as she held her prize-winning puppy, Diva, in the spotlight of yet another victory, the questions remained. The transformation from revolutionary to suburban matron was not without its mysteries, and the ghosts of the SLA lingered. Had Tanya been a figment of brainwashing, or was she the inevitable product of a life suffocated by privilege? Was she a victim, or had she simply worn that mask long enough to survive? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you like content like this, please subscribe. We try to mix our videos between long and short content to keep it interesting, but let me know who you would like to see us cover. Thank you as always to our patrons. It means a lot to have your support. We post a new podcast every week, and you can vote on the people you would like to see us cover next. And thanks to everyone who watches, likes, shares, or comments. You make this channel and community great. I love you all, and as always, thanks for watching.